Britain from its earliest days was regarded as a rich and fertile land by those who had the courage to make the journeys necessary to get to it. But those groups of people didn't all welcome the presence of the others. There was bitter conflict and bloodshed. And in the years immediately after Christianity arrived in Britain, there was bitter feuding between not just these four groups of people, but several others who came to these shores over the next 1,000 years or so as well. And we'll now begin to examine how all the conflict and bloodshed between those groups led to the building of a set of legal structures and government administration based on the principles that democratic discussion amongst everyone is always going to bring a freedom and contentment that's impossible to achieve by applying the principle that might is right. And all those different peoples were resolved to blend and work together to produce the Britain that we enjoyed to the end of the 20th century. And we'll now see how successful the Romans were with the tactics they used in trying to reconcile those different groups, and what happened when the Romans left and even more groups began to arrive. The greatest culture shock to the British way of life of those days was that the Romans were powerful enough to govern by force. Gone was the idea of the small local community governing itself by consent. The Romans found it much easier to govern large numbers of people in small areas. The towns that grew up around their camps, like this one at Wroxeter in Shropshire, brought flowing water and the consequent improvements in hygiene, bathing and central heating, health benefits of fresh vegetables, and the roads that connected those camps and those towns to each other that enabled the quick and efficient movement of goods and people are still being used for the same purposes today. The Romans gave us our calendar. Many of those things which the Romans brought to Britain have made an enormously positive contribution, but it was an imposition of government by force on a people who were developing ways of government by discussion and agreement. And we've already seen how ruthlessly the Romans dealt with the insurrection by Boadicea in 61 AD. That was the model that the British people were to get used to for nigh on 400 years. But they also came to rely on the protection which the Romans afforded them. Protection, for example, when the Roman emperors Antony and Hadrian both built their famous walls up in the north of Britain to protect them from the Picts and the Scots. We must remember that Rome and Britain had been competing against each other on equal terms for many centuries. In 387 BC, 400 years before all of this was happening, Brennus, a Celtic king from Brittany, took an army through Gaul, modern France, and after an act of treachery and murder by the Romans while negotiations were being conducted under a flag of truce, Brennus was so incensed that he continued his march south and went on to ransack most of the city of Rome. He then stopped short of complete annihilation and made a peace settlement in exchange for a considerable quantity of gold. If Brennus had gone on and decided to destroy the fledgling city of Rome, the Roman Empire might never have existed, and the spiritual leadership and learning of the Druids may have dominated the Western world instead. But it didn't happen that way. A clash of cultures developed between the pagan, rural way of life of the Druids and the more imposed urban organization of the Romans. Boadicea, or Boudica as she was more properly known until a Renaissance spelling mistake changed the way that we refer to her, Boadicea rose up not just against the Romans' domination, but in defense of the Celtic, Druidic way of life that had been developing in Britain for thousands of years. The manner of the defeat of Boadicea's uprising in 60 AD, less than 20 years after the Roman invasion of Britain, was an illustration of just how important the Romans felt it was to totally destroy the competing, conflicting, and far older culture, thousands of years ahead of that of Rome, whose foundation stone had only been laid less than 700 years before Julius Caesar arrived. In contrast to the way Britain was developing, assimilation and integration of the best of what the different races who came to Britain could offer was not part of the Romans' thinking. That's why Paulinus, the leader of the Roman legions in Britain, had taken the bulk of his armed forces up to Anglesey to eliminate the Druidic stronghold that existed on the island off the north coast of Wales. Boadicea's uprising wasn't just a rebellion against the domination of the Romans. It was a last-ditch attempt to save the Druidic Celtic culture, which was the spiritual unifying force that bound together the many different Celtic tribes and their kings and queens who had been moving to and settling and living in Britain for thousands of years. Which gods should be worshipped was one of the fundamental problems facing the Romans in their government of Britain. There were the pagans who worshipped the sun and the moon and who required the relevant sacrifices to them. There were the Romans and their gods, chief amongst whom was the emperor made of flesh and blood, who demanded to be worshipped as a god. And there were the Christians who refused to bow down and do obeisance to either of those two sets of deities. If due sacrifice wasn't made to the sun and the moon, the pagans were concerned that their gods would show their anger in the form of pestilence, flood, famine, or a failed harvest, or other earthly catastrophe. Likewise, if the Christians didn't bow down to the Roman emperor, they would be condemned to death and the rounding up and imprisonment of Christians, in due course to be fed to the lions, as a spectator sport in Rome has become the stuff of legend. The Roman style of government in Britain, certainly at the outset, was indeed authoritarian, and the pagans had no problem bowing down to just another god and making just another sacrifice to show their allegiance to the Roman emperors. So the Christians found themselves persecuted by both the Romans and the pagans. Many of the Roman emperors at best condoned and at worst required the destruction of complete Christian communities. Throughout Europe, but particularly in Britain where the Christian community was most developed, there was a Christian Holocaust during the first few centuries of Christianity. And over the next few hundred years, after considerable bloodshed, they were forced to seek out remote areas in which to practice their faith. One example is here at Whitthorne on the southwest coast of Scotland, and behind me here is St. Ninian's Chapel. What is so remarkable is that the Christian communities survived at all. But in fact, the Druids community that had built up in Glastonbury and been converted as a consequence of the arrival of Joseph of Arimathea developed into a Christian community itself, based in the old Wattle and Daub church, which was already gaining iconic status, recognized as the centre of Christian learning in the whole of Britain. And it was able to thrive during the reign particularly of good King Lucius, to the extent that Lucius wrote to the Bishop of Rome in 156 AD and declared Britain to be a Christian country. However, what Lucius was able to achieve was the exception rather than the rule. And for over 250 years after Joseph of Arimathea's arrival, the persecution of the British Christians by the Romans continued largely unhindered, whilst the pagans enjoyed harassing their local Christian communities at the same time as well. The festivals observed by those early Christian communities were the ones defined in the Old Testament of the Bible, amongst which were the Feast of the Passover, which occurred at about the same time as the pagan Easter, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which was an 8-day holiday held immediately after the harvest in thanksgiving and celebration. Those early Christians didn't celebrate Christmas. In fact, it's been calculated that the probable date of Jesus' birth was in the first week of October 4 BC, because that's the date when a number of planets all met together in almost exactly the same place in the sky to produce that particularly bright star that we are told in the Bible guided the wise men to Bethlehem. A calculation supported by the fact that the shepherds stop watching their flocks by night at about the end of October because of the weather in that part of the world. The 25th of December just wasn't a part of the calendar of the Christian communities of those days. On the other hand, in different ways, it formed a very important part of the celebrations and festivals of both the Romans and the pagans. The 21st of December is the winter solstice, when the sun stops sinking in the sky and begins to climb again, and the days get longer. A date in the calendar celebrated by the pagan Druids, and marked, of course, by the configuration of stones at Stonehenge. The Romans celebrated Saturnalia, which the Emperor Nero tried unsuccessfully to restrict to a mere 5 days of drunkenness and orgy. The kiss under the mistletoe was a Druidic custom, and originally designed to be an opportunity for reconciliation rather than an opportunity for the faint-hearted. And the Christmas tree and the colours worn by Santa Claus hark back to the snow and the particularly gruesome pagan sacrifices already well established centuries before the Christian era began. Similarly, Easter is a pagan celebration of fertility and harks back to the god Astarte, or Ishtar, when amongst other practices eggs would be rolled down rabbit holes to encourage the earth to yield its goodness in the coming months. That particular festival was celebrated, as you might imagine, in the early spring. Another important pagan festival was the midsummer solstice, when the sun had reached its maximum height in the sky and would begin to descend, separated from the winter solstice by exactly 6 months. Samhain, or as we know it now, Halloween on the 31st of October, is another particularly pagan festival. The significance of the circle as a pagan symbol will not have been lost amongst all of the images that we've just been watching. And the holding of all of these various rituals and festivals had for centuries become a problem for the Romans governing Britain, and it had proved impossible for them to keep the peace. In 306 AD, that was all about to change, when the only Briton to become the Emperor of Rome was crowned at York. After Diocletian had brought stability to the government of the Roman Empire, it left the way for Constantine to be crowned emperor here in 306, taking over from his father Constantius Chlorus. Constantine brought far-reaching measures to the Christian Church. In 316, he called the Edict of Milan, and in 325 he called the Council of Nicaea, both of which laid firm foundations for the future. What Constantine did after banning further Christian persecution was to persuade all these groups that they should celebrate their festivals together. The Christians could celebrate the birth of Jesus at the same time as the pagans were celebrating the winter solstice and the Romans were celebrating Saturnalia. The Christians could celebrate the Passover at the same time as the pagans were celebrating the feast of Ishtar, or Astarte. The word Easter isn't to be found in the Bible, it's a pagan word. In order to give the Christians something to celebrate at the summer solstice, it was suggested that because John the Baptist was born 6 months before Jesus, that they celebrated John the Baptist's birthday in the middle of the year. That's a suggestion which didn't really catch on. There's been discussion and controversy about these compromises ever since. But it laid the foundations for the Christian Church to be centred firmly in Rome, And although the teachings of the original Celtic Church, founded by Joseph of Arimathea in Glastonbury, would continue to flourish for some time, it became inevitable that there would eventually be a confrontation and a reckoning between the Church of Rome and the Celtic Church in Britain. Constantine's plans were by no means immediately successful. Conflict and bloodshed would continue for several hundred years, but the foundations of a kind of reconciliation had been laid.